high accuracy for southern western Ghats as well, using our techniques. And one of the important things is to validate our data against already existing previous data. So initially I had already mentioned that the previously existing data were not that accurate, and what we found was that our data was much more accurate than the previously existing data. So as you can see here, the previously existing data could not classify different vegetation types. Okay, so one of the major factors which we could use for understanding species distributions is land use associations, as I mentioned previously. But the other major factor is landscape metrics. So by landscape metrics, what I mean is the different parameters of a land use type. So for example, if you have a fragmented forest, you can have different parameters for a fragment. For example, the size of a fragment can influence the biodiversity within that fragment. Some species might need larger fragments, some species might require only smaller fragments. So the biodiversity in a particular fragment could be defined by the landscape metrics. Like the size of the fragment, the edge, the length of the edges of the fragment, the connectivity of a fragment, the shape of a fragment, etc. can affect the species distributions. So knowing about the information about landscape metrics is also important while we need to understand about habitat suitability of different species. So we also could map the different landscape metrics in our study region, and we found that the landscape metrics of different land use types are different in our study region. And recently, many studies have used these landscape metrics to map the potential habitat suitable areas of different species. And to be frank, there are only very few studies conducted in India using these land use associations and land use metrics. So this has a huge potential in the future with several different species, and hence I encourage all of you to follow this literature and try to perform different studies using land use associations and land use metrics of the species. And these land use metrics can be used for studying the theory of island biogeography as well. Some of you might already be knowing about the theory of island biogeography. So this theory was postulated by MacArthur and Wilson. So this theory was formulated in South American islands. So what they found was that as the distance of the islands are farther away from the mainland, the rates of extinctions will increase when the distance of an island is smaller from that of the mainland. And the other finding by them was that the size of an island matters with regard to the extinction rate. So the larger the island, the extinction rates are smaller, and the smaller the island, the extinction rates are higher. So we can apply this theory in case of forest fragments as well. So as we know, in the Western Ghats, there are a lot of several fragmented habitats, and you can apply the same theory as that of the islands to the forest fragments in the Western Ghats. So once you know about these characters, like the land use associations of the species, then the landscape metrics, and if we know the other abiotic factors affecting the species, we can model the species distributions. So you might already know that in order to understand the niche of a species, you might need to have information about the abiotic factors. You will need to have information about the biotic factors, which usually include the interactions between different species, and you will need to have information about the dispersal of a species. So once you have the information about abiotic factors and biotic factors, you can go for species distribution model. So among abiotic factors, you can have the information about land use, you can have the information about population densities, you can have the information about land use metrics, you can have the information about climate. So you can have different abiotic informations, and if you have different abiotic information about different abiotic factors, then you can go for species distribution modeling. And as I said, the studies which have undertaken species distribution modeling on different species in India are very less. So there is a huge potential for species distribution modeling in India, and there are also a lot of different methods for species distribution modeling. So one of the most commonly adapted methods for species distribution modeling is Maxent, and then you have other regression modeling methods which you can use, and then there are different factors which you have to be careful when you are doing species distribution modeling. I'm not getting into complicated things of species distribution modeling here, but what I want to rather convey here is that you can do species distribution modeling of several species, and then you can understand about the niche and habitat suitability of that species, and this habitat suitability models can be used for conservation and management of species. So this is one study which we performed for understanding habitat suitability of two different primate species in the southern Western Ghats, the study region which I previously mentioned. And what we found was that, what we looked was the habitat suitability of two different primate species. One of the primate species was a frugivorous species. As you know, the frugivorous species can be a more of a habitat generalist species, and because more of a habitat specialist species, because the resources, which are mainly fruits, are not that much available resources, and then we compared it with that of a folivorous species, which feeds mainly on leaves, and as you know, leaves are abundant resources in most of our forests. And what we saw was that when we mapped the groups of these species, there was not much differences in the habitat suitability of the groups. But when we looked at the solitary males of these species, what we found was that the solitary males of the folivorous species had more habitat suitable areas than the solitary males of the frugivorous species. So what we found that was that the habitat suitability of solitary males would probably affect the dispersal of the males between different forest fragments, and this could have a huge implication on conservation and management of these animal species. And I want to introduce to another kind of modeling, which is the agent-based modeling. As I said, in the agent-based modeling, also we use different factors such as the land use associations, we use land use metrics, and we also use species distribution models for agent-based modeling. So I want to demonstrate agent-based modeling using an example. So this is one of the studies we had conducted in Sri Lanka, and this study was on mapping the snake bite potential risk in Sri Lanka. So as you can see here in this picture, you have different land uses. So this is a landscape, and then you have different people moving across these land uses. So these people are considered as agents. So you know that in a landscapes there can be different people in the same landscape. So there could be different farmers in the same landscape. So for example, you have a rice farmer here, you have a D farmer here, and those different people could have different behaviors. So for example, a rice farmer